Started. Professor Bogues is going to say a couple of words before we start the second session of the day. So, Professor Bogues.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is to thank you all again for coming to this inaugural graduate symposium of the Center for the Slavery and Justice. To also say to you, repeat what I said on yesterday morning. I'm doing so many meetings and speaking. Yesterday morning. That really, if at the end of all of this you want to do a network and you want assistance in creating that network, then please let Michael know, and then we will try and fund this as much as we can. I also want to say to you, I'm going to be here for the papers 1 to 2. I slip out at 2 because I'm speaking at 2:30 elsewhere. But I just wanted to be here this morning to show my support. Also to apologize for confusion yesterday, which I'm not quite sure it happened. But I thought people expected me here at lunchtime when I was in another meeting. Right? And I thought I'd made it clear that I couldn't come back and I wouldn't see you all until dinner. So my apologies for that confusion. That meant that one person's paper was not, two persons, well, Michael I see every day, so I will talk to him about his paper. But that meant one other of your colleagues did not have a commentary. And so I've spoken to him last night, and my hope is that he will send me his paper, right, for commentary, so that he will, I will be able to read it properly and make that comment. So, really, just to thank you all again for coming, to thank Michael for organizing this, and to say when you see me slip out at about 10 past 2, it's not a sign of disrespect. I just have to get ready for a 2:30 talk that I have to give. So good luck and thanks again.
Hi, how are you all doing? My name is Mike Litwack. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Modern Culture and Media, and I'm so thrilled to be able to introduce the panelists for the second roundtable of the day. The first speaker is Robert Murray, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Kentucky. His dissertation, Whiteness in Africa, Americo-Liberians, the Transformations of Geographies of Race, examines the constructed racial identities of African-American settlers in colonial Liberia as they traverse the Atlantic between the United States and West Africa during the first half of the 19th century. Evelyn Amponsah is currently pursuing her doctorate in social and political thought at York University in Toronto. She was born in Ghana, but grew up in Toronto. She enjoys complicating things and making people feel uncomfortable. We are also delighted and honored to have our faculty respondent today, Patricia Lott, who is a PhD candidate in African American studies. Who is a postdoc who was a PhD candidate in African American studies. But now, we are so lucky to have at Brown as the Ruth J. Simmons Postdoctoral Fellow at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Professor Lott did complete her PhD in the Department of African American Studies some time ago with a dissertation titled Disremembered and Unaccounted For, a critical genealogy of amnesia regarding racial slavery in the U.S. North, 1820 to 1861. Could you please help me in welcoming our panelists to Brown? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be speaking today. I hope to gain some insights that are really going to help me to direct my project, as right now it's still a very early work in progress. So I want to start off with this first slide here. This is actually it is a plaque that is at the Cape Coast Castle in Ghana. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Cape Coast Castle is a castle which was owned by the Dutch, I think went to the Portuguese, and then eventually ends up being British owned. And it held slaves, and this was one of the final stops that the slaves would, where they would be held before going through the door of no return on a journey across the transatlantic. And so when I went to Ghana, I visited the castle, and at the end of the tour, this plaque here is beside the male dungeon, and it says, "An everlasting memory of the anguish for our ancestors. May those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their roots. May humanity never again perpetuate such injustice against humanity. We, the living, vow to uphold this." And the way the tour guide presented this plaque was as an apology, right? As an apology on behalf of the Ghanaian people for the part that they played in the slave trade. And so at that moment, this apology became very curious for me and interesting in a few different ways. I found it problematic, and this is what actually pushed me to start doing some more research. And so, yeah, I'm gonna get into my paper now then. So, in 2007, there was an apparent move by the Ghanaian state and society to revive a local interest in slavery. This move to stimulate an interest is curious and comes as an intervention to debates and studies that argue that transatlantic slavery has long been over, telling post-slavery subjects to forget and move on. This paper attempts to understand this move as part of the greater post-colonial structures that constantly define and redefine the human. What is it about the trajectory of the liberal human that conjures up notions of the slave so that today, Ghana necessarily feels that there is a need to remember slavery on the home front? There is something ghostly about the afterlives of slavery and its consequences on descendants that's prompting Ghana in this particular moment to embark on a remembering of slavery. So I began this project by tracing the slave from Ghana in a more local sense and then broadly through its global networks and connections, i.e. the diaspora. So a lot of the research and work that I read is usually, I guess, located in the Americas and then going back to Ghana. So I'm actually starting from Ghana and moving forward. I excavate a comparatively transatlantic history of blackness that coexists with the more familiar accounts of progressive liberalism and racial global uplift. I locate Africa, specifically Ghana, in this debate, attempting to understand how the remembering of slavery in the present simultaneously conjures up a history of denial of African and therefore black subjectivity, while affirming the social imaginaries of freedom in the present. I do this by looking at the Ghana Joseph Project. The project sheds light on this imagined post-colonial relationship to the diaspora, their attempt to affirm their position within modernity through global networks, and the legacies of slavery that have left many members of the diaspora in a purgatorial state of subjecthood. So, the story of Joseph. As I mentioned, the project that I'm specifically looking at is called the Joseph Project. For those of you who are not familiar with the story of Joseph from the Bible, I'll go over it quickly. So in the Bible, Genesis chapter 37, you will find a story about Joseph, who was the second youngest son of Jacob and his favorite. Joseph's brothers were jealous of Jacob's love for Joseph and Joseph's dreams that were prophecies in a way. So they eventually plot against him and sell him into slavery. Joseph's brothers and Joseph ends up in Egypt and becomes a very powerful man in Pharaoh's house. His brothers end up in Egypt, and they end up in Egypt to buy grain. What happens is that Joseph recognizes his brothers, but his brothers don't recognize him. He puts them through a series of tests to see if they have changed. And so this is an illustration. So they eventually passed this test, and he says to them, "So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. He hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler throughout all of Egypt. Therefore it's all good." Right? You sold me into slavery, but I've become this great man in Pharaoh's house. He forgives them. He sees that they've changed, and he forgives them. So the project, the Joseph Project, takes its name from this story in the Bible. Ghana attempts to evoke its own Josephs to embark on a journey of reconciliation and reconnection. Further, there was an appeal as part of the project to the responsibility that these ancestors have to their former homeland, to return, invest, and support the brothers and sisters who once sold them. So I argue that the apology and project are riddled with contradictions that conceal the historical relations that allow the slave trade to flourish. So for Afro-pessimists such as Hartman, Membe, and Sexton, slavery and post-slavery subjects are haunted. This haunting reveals a tension between postmodern imaginations of slavery and African descendants' imaginings of slavery. These materialized imaginings of transatlantic slavery unveil a tension between figurative slavery, being enslaved by an object, concept, or history, and actual transatlantic slavery, literal enslavement of bodies by owners. Modes of liberalism and postmodernism suggest that the figurative and the literal are not in conversation with each other. However, transatlantic slavery informs and shapes the figurative slavery experienced by post-slavery subjects living in the North Americas and on the African continent. This tension becomes apparent when looking at contemporary sites and their debates on slavery that suggest that the suffering experienced by post-slavery subject is more about the individual's own subjectivity/agency rather than a product of historical relations. However, if we draw out these tensions between figurative slavery and transatlantic slavery, we see how these two concepts are collapsed into each other. These two concepts are further implicated in the ways in which we attempt to understand Africa and Black bodies within modernity. Africa plays a significant role in the formation of modernity, specifically its positionality within global modernity. Africa is then understood as attempting to become modern, belonging to the global era, through these particular networks, as well as by having multiple sovereign states. The major circuit of its global role and formation is mediated through the bodies of the diaspora. However, here we have both a physical and a genealogical representation of modernity. So the physical being these connections that, the physical connections of the diaspora living in the West, therefore being looked at as modern, and the genealogical being the connections they then have to Africa or Ghana. So the Joseph Project attempts to capitalize on this genealogy and its goal to make the 21st century the African century. This project was initiated by the Ghanaian Tourism Board, explicitly aims to, I quote, reconcile and unite African people so that their positive spirit and strengths are released in a focused manner to elevate Africa and Africans worldwide. The Joseph Project was initiated in 2007, which was the 50th, which was the 50th anniversary of Ghana's independence, as well as the 200th anniversary of the passing of laws banning slave trading in the United States. So these things together gave the year a resonance suitable to launch the monumentous project. Africa's Josephs were invited to participate in a healing ceremony of atonement, the restoration of slave forts, and visit significant landmarks in the slave trade, including Asinmaso, where slaves would receive their last bath, and the Salaga slave market. Further, the Joseph Project entailed a diasporan visa, a stamp on your passport, granting diasporans entry into Ghana without having to pay for a visa. So here are some of the highlights. Part of it also was owning land in Ghana, so it would give members of the diaspora the opportunity to own land in Ghana. So this is part of the project was also visiting significant stops on the slave route. Genealogical tracing, so there would be a collection of DNA samples that would allow members of the diaspora to trace their family trees and rebuild their family trees. A healing and a pilgrimage. And like I said, the diasporan visa, which would grant members of the diaspora entry into Ghana without having to pay for a visa. So the project was a success in that many members of the diaspora participated in the many events. The project saw such people as Rita Marley, wife of late Bob Marley, who received an award on behalf of her late husband. Though the successful aspects of the project were evident in many ways, today it has been reduced to a box filled with dusty information brochures in French. This is apparently due to the change in government and other politics impeding the project's ability to continue. Knowing what we know of the Joseph Project, it becomes an important task to situate it as an initiative aimed at reasserting Ghana into modernity through its global networks. The project seems to suggest that without the reconciliation of Africans worldwide, Africa cannot be uplifted and cannot move forward and cannot be elevated. A few things that are useful to note is the way that Ghana is using the word African in Africa and how that reinforces a particular narrative of blackness and subjectivity. Africa as a continent has historically occupied a position in global modernity where it was unable to kill or let its subject live. Further, many Africans were forced into slavery, therefore turning them into slaves incapable of the self-understanding, self-consciousness, and self-representation needed to be subjects, casting a universalization of Africa and the bodies it produced into a place where it can never be sovereign and the bodies can never be subjects. Ghana, apologizing in this post-colonial, post-independence period, ushers Africa into a space where its facilitation of the selling of African bodies, resulting in the killing of these bodies, who today are understood as independent, changes its history and presents Africa as sovereign. Bembe tells us that the ultimate expression of sovereignty is the production of a general norms by a body made up of free and equal men and women. These men and women are appointed as full subjects, capable of full understanding, self-consciousness, and self-representation. Simply, Membe is pointing to how subjects reflect the sovereign and how the sovereign reflect the subject. The Joseph Project draws on this, attempting to call on its diasporic subjects in order to make the third millennium the African millennium. That was a quote. Here I ask how subjectivity is transformed post-colonially and post-emancipation so that the black body becomes understood as a human who was always an emancipated body and Africa as a state that always had power. I further establish that as a sovereign state with diasporic connections, Africa, though not a state or a country, is turned into one and is now forced to reckon with ghosts and haunting. What I mean by that is Ghana is now taking up a project that is that they're calling an African project rather than making it very specific as a Ghanaian project. The technologies that were employed as part of the biopolitical structures are necessarily conduit to the type of phantoms, ghosts, and haunting and shadows that Afro-pessimists point to. The conjuring up of the historical Africa, which has been looked at as a homogeneous country rather than a set of sovereign nations, remind us of the way blackness is determined from without. Notions of Africa that have been historically deployed and maintained in the contemporary moment frame it as a problematic place which produces problems and problem bodies. Global power shifts as well as modernity now make Africa responsible for these problems. The instrumentality of modernity is to constantly define Africa as unmodern. In the post-emancipation, post-colonial period, modernity has to be presented as an option to Africa because of the way responsibility is conflated with modern nation state. Therefore, repositioning Africa, which has a particular effects on its relationships, particularly its relationships with those living in the diaspora. Post-colonial interactions of blackness have reinscribed notions of humanity to the black body that was once a slave and today is a figurative slave. Therefore, the historicity of slavery has been shifted. Subjectivity, as described by Hartman, is ascribed to a slave at the point of emancipation, and therefore making him or her responsible. Africa and Africans are now viewed as both victims and perpetrators who sold each other into slavery. As Africa looks for solutions to its current problems as a third world developing nation, it is constantly reminded of the residues of the past. So further, there needs to be a tracing of the effects of colonialism, slavery, and racialization that have caused the fragmentation of the black body. I therefore ask, what are post-slavery subjects doing with this fragmentation? Are they attempting to put these pieces together? If so, how? The answers to these queries are curious and propel us forward when we attempt to make intelligible the Joseph Project. The answers to these queries are the project, in its attempts to address and reconcile what I like to call the fragmented African subject, engages in and creates historicity by first reclaiming Ghana and Africa's position as sovereign, reclaiming its subjects, hence gesturing to its power, and giving post-slavery subjects an official place to call home, reconciling for many a question of citizenship and belonging. The initiation/implementation of this project was criticized by many, including members of the diaspora, both living in Ghana and abroad, in its failure to offer full citizenship to those who wanted it. If Ghana really wanted its brothers and sisters to come home and invest, they wanted to be treated as brothers and sisters and not as outsiders. This tension is one that exists for obvious reasons. What would it mean both locally and globally for Ghana to incorporate black subjects into the nation state? Not just with a diasporan visa, but with full citizenship. What would this mean for the history and legacy of slavery? Ghana is attempting to mediate this tension by reintroducing slavery into the Ghanaian society, thereby connecting history to the present. By bringing up this ghost into the imaginaries of the Ghanaian people, new imaginaries are being created that incorporate memory, history, and pain, notions that normally prompt an individual to move on. Except in this case, they are prompting a certain type of historical shift in post-colonial thinking and for post-slavery subjects. I underscore this shift because of the erasures that are being created and ignored in Ghana's attempt to become modern. Africa is constantly haunted by the inability to redefine itself from within. Ghana attempts to solve this issue by looking to its outside networks at a time when Africa can be held culpable. Culpability creates a blameworthy individual, in this case, nation state, which Ghana is happy to be, as long as in its blameworthiness, it also becomes modernity worthy as well. So there's just a few major themes that I just want to go over quickly. So one of them is obviously slavery, so how Ghana is remembering slavery. Then we're looking at diaspora and memory, figurative and literal. Black and African subjectivity, so how Ghana is attempting to establish itself in a contemporary era through its global connections. Reconciliation and apology. So what does it really mean for Ghana to really take up an apology and to make this apology? And lastly, imagination. So how the state imagined its relationship to the diaspora and how they're mediating this imagined relationship. Thank you.
This all looks very expensive. I'm putting that down here. Thank you, everybody, for putting this conference together. I'm really pleased to be here and very impressed with how papers combine. The epilogue of my dissertation is the Ghana project, so serendipity. For something totally different, I will give you an offshoot of my dissertation that is one of those pieces of research that needs to be out there, and I can't jam it no matter how hard I try into my dissertation. So right now my vision for this is a journal article. So with that in mind, bodies, literal ones at least. In the spring months of 1838, probably in early April, 2 graves from one of Baltimore's Potter's Fields, cemeteries designated for the poor and indigent, were robbed of their contents. If the order had been fulfilled as requested, the bodies would have been African-American teenage girls, each weighing less than 100 pounds. That the bodies were priced at $6 apiece suggests that the requested age and weight had been successfully attained by the hired grave robber or resurrectionist of Baltimore's Washington Medical College, an African-American recorded only by his nickname, Bill. The 2 bodies were then taken to another doctor's private dissecting room, packed into the same barrel, and then preserved in 18 gallons of whiskey. A master cooper was brought in to seal the barrel tightly, and then it was placed into a larger barrel, with the intervening space filled with bran. In this manner, the large barrel is labeled 4 bushels of bran and consigned to a ship for Boston under that false label. The barrels were dispatched to the Boston trading firm of Hutchins, Hurd & Company, a firm that dealt in West India goods and wholesale groceries. The entire cost of the operation was $23.75. As the vessel sailed for Boston, it unknowingly raced a brace of letters bound for Boston and Hanover, New Hampshire. The Boston letter notified the proprietors of Ezra Hutchins and John Hurd's trading firm that the large barrel of bran soon to arrive in their warehouse was destined for Dr. Reuben D. Musset, professor of anatomy and surgery at Dartmouth College. The trading firm was apparently familiar enough with this particular type of cereal grain to know not to open the barrel to inspect its contents. The second letter sped to Hanover to warn Musset that a barrel would soon be arriving in Boston that would need to be spirited to Hanover quickly. And so the remains of two indigent black children who died in Baltimore in early April found themselves on the dissecting tables at Dartmouth Medical College by July. And they were not the first to make this journey. These bodies were part of a broader national trade among medical professionals in search of cadavers for the purposes of medical study broadly and dissection in particular. Anatomy was a significant course of study for 19th century doctors. Michael Sapol has argued that while germ theory allowed trained doctors to separate themselves through the language of science from other traditional claimants to healing powers, in the latter half of the 19th century, anatomy performed that same task in the early part of the century. Doctors used their familiarity with the human body and the power to wield the scalpel to emphasize their scientific stature and authoritative claims to medical knowledge in juxtaposition against folk medicine, midwives, and traditional healing practices. As doctors wrapped themselves in the cloak of professionalism, the possession of a medical degree from a chartered institution held growing importance, and the number of medical schools multiplied across the United States. By 1849, the United States boasted 38 chartered institutions in operation. Concomitant with this growth of medical schools was the demand for cadavers in order to perform dissections. At this time, the only legal means to acquire bodies for dissection was via executed prisoners, and the growing demands of medical students far outstripped this meager supply. The deficiency was filled by grave robbers and resurrection men like Baltimore's Bill. Medical schools located in rural areas or small towns found themselves at a disadvantage in securing cadavers. Seeking the easiest targets, resurrectionists largely targeted the graves of the poor, indigent, and unknown. The growing cities of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and Baltimore, filled with itinerant travelers and sailors, an impoverished working class, immigrants, and most importantly, substantial numbers of free people of color and slaves, became centers of supply for dissecting room tables. Those doctors and medical schools located in the countryside lacked widespread access to these types of subjects and found themselves either risking the ire of the community by robbing nearby graves or importing bodies from these distant points. Sapol's work focuses on the class elements of anatomy while acknowledging what he calls a racial determinant in the selection of bodies for anatomical study. Harriet A. Washington's Medical Apartheid examines the racial dynamics of medical experimentation with a nod to class dynamics. Although Washington notes that superficially the, quote, robbing of black graveyards to fill white anatomists' laboratories appears a purely racial issue, end quote, the employment of African-American resurrectionists like Bill complicates this simplistic formula. In the inverse formulation of Sapol, Washington concludes that the, quote, nature of the medical abuse is racial, but class and self-interest could play pivotal roles, as with the black resurrectionists, end quote. Sapol and Washington are arguing two sides of the same coin, but their respective formulas suggest that the interpretive line drawn between class and race should be blurred, since a primary objective of creating a degraded and subjugated race is to create an equally subjugated and degraded class. Not only has the intentional targeting of African Americans for purposes of anatomical study been well documented by scholars, but this traffic in these subjects has also received scholarly attention. In addition to Sapol and Washington, Todd L. Savitt has dedicated a long historical career to African American medical history. Savitt has also examined the widespread preference for black subjects expressed by doctors and even spotlighted a regional trade network in which bodies were funneled from Richmond, Norfolk, and Alexandria to the University of Virginia's more isolated medical school in Charlottesville. Yet Savitt's work has overwhelmingly focused on the southern slave states and physicians with comparatively easy and localized access to the bodies of deceased slaves and free people of color. Gretchen Long's very recent study of African American medical care during slavery and emancipation likewise notes the expansive use of black subjects for anatomical study, implicitly linking the practice to white masters' control over enslaved African Americans' bodies. But like Savitt, Long's study is firmly rooted in the South. The bodies dispatched to Dartmouth, however, are different from those previously studied by scholars. Although originating in a southern slave state, they were shipped to New England, displaying a scale of commerce far greater than a purely regional network. And they were also directed to a particularly unusual medical student. One of the cadavers, there were two, was intended as a gift for Musset as an expression of gratitude for his assistance in admitting Samuel F. McGill, the intended recipient of the second body, into the medical college. This was no small feat, as the new student was a mixed-race man of color originally from Baltimore who had immigrated to Liberia with his family when he was 12 years old in 1827. Liberia was the child of the Society for Colonizing of Free People of Color of the United States, which most of you probably know as the American Colonization Society, because that is a mouthful, the ACS. Established as a place for relocating the United States' free black population in December 1828, the sickly colony of Liberia earned a well-deserved reputation for an impoverished settlement coupled with an incredibly high mortality rate. The McGill family, however, was one of the most prominent families in Liberia. The family's progenitor, George, had been a freedman in Baltimore, working as a lay Methodist minister and teacher. His decision to relocate his family stemmed from his connections with leaders of the colonization movement, who assured him high-ranking positions within the colonial administration. Building upon this foundation, the McGills counted among their ranks merchants, colonial administrators, and the first African-American governor of a Liberian colony, John Brown Russwurm, Samuel McGill's brother-in-law. Samuel's graduations from Dartmouth Medical School with the class of 1839 marked an unheralded milestone for African Americans. While James McCune Smith is recognized as the first African American to receive a medical degree, he was forced to acquire his credentials abroad at the University of Glasgow after being denied admittance on account of his race to several American institutions. Another man, David Jones Peck, is usually identified as the first African American physician to receive a medical degree from an American institution. Peck, however, graduated from Rush Medical College in Chicago in 1847, nearly a decade after McGill left Dartmouth. In fact, Peck graduated in the same year as Dempsey R. Fletcher, a student of McGill's and the second Liberian colonist to pass degree in hand through Dartmouth's doors. How McGill and the two deceased African-American girls met in a New England dissecting room is an Atlantic tale of motion. In West Africa, McGill and his fellow Liberian settlers found the results of their Atlantic mobility in a new racial categorization. Their African neighbors recognized the vast cultural differences between themselves and these newcomers and racially categorized the settlers as whites. This is not to suggest that the Americo-Liberians perceived of themselves as white. This is not a story of black people wishing they were white. Underline that and put stars. But they did use their African whiteness to craft a foreign exotic Liberian identity, which escaped associations of primitivism through its subjugation of heathen African blackness. They then employed this identity in making demands for concessions in education, travel, and treatment from white Americans. If control over African blackness was fundamental to this Liberian's identity claims to an elevated blackness, then control over degraded black bodies in the American medical context was yet another tool in establishing that identity. McGill was a master of this negotiation. When writing to leaders of the Maryland State Colonization Society, the MSCS, in the fall of 1835 to request assistance in securing a medical education, McGill implicitly tied his suppression of Africans to his desire for education. In the wake of an attack on the Americo-Liberian settlement at Bossa Cove, roughly 300 American settlers had marched from Monrovia, McGill included, to the village of the local leader responsible for the massacre and laid waste to the town. In light of his activity during this assault, McGill's fellow students had promoted him to the rank of 3rd lieutenant. In his letter, McGill related his tale of martial glory in detail before abruptly concluding with his request for assistance. Although the transition is jarring, the rapid transition from war to medicine implicitly distinguished McGill from his heathen African surroundings, heathen his word, and instead allowed him to claim a civilized identity through suppression of black barbarity. McGill's choice of correspondence was fortuitous. Moses Shepard, a leading Baltimore merchant and philanthropist, had previously served on the board of governors of the MSCS and was personally acquainted with McGill's father. A group of white colonizationists met at Shepard's house in December 1835. found the prospect of educating a settler to serve as a colonial physician tempting, and secured a position of sorts in Baltimore's Washington Medical College. They left it to Shepard to temper the young Liberian's enthusiasm for his future as a medical student. Shepard wrote, "You must not expect to hear the term, Mr. McGill, from a white man. In the college, you must appear as a servant. There is not a medical school in the United States into which you could be admitted in any other character." End quote. To his credit, McGill accepted this rather grim forecast and made his way to Baltimore, prepared to appear as a servant rather than be admitted to the institution. As you can imagine, the experiment ended predictably. McGill began attending lectures in November of 1836, and by December, the other medical students had organized and demanded the expulsion of the, quote, Negro boy, end quote, who had, as they said, gone far beyond the limited space granted him and has encroached as far upon the privileges enjoyed by the students as to wound their feelings, disgust them by his actions. While McGill had been technically instructed to appear as a servant, his fellow white Baltimorean students seemed to expect the proud and freeborn Liberian to behave as a servant as well. Fortunately, an acquaintance of the MSCS governor in Liberia, a Dr. Edward E. Phelps, who served on the faculty of the Medical College at the University of Vermont, agreed to take on McGill as a private medical student at his home in Windsor, Vermont, a small village located along the border with New Hampshire. Although McGill would be a private apprentice, Phelps assured the MSCS that he would learn the curriculum of the University of Vermont. And this transition from the Washington Medical College to Phelps' tutelage also initiated McGill into the Acaronian world of cadaver procurement for medical dissection. Like many rural doctors and medical schools, Phelps engaged in an illegal commerce of bodies from distant cities to stock his dissecting rooms. He also shared their assumptions that black bodies were preferable for anatomical study. Without hesitation, he recommended to the MSCS that McGill bring cadavers up from Baltimore. He wrote, "I would advise him to bring subjects with him, for in any case, practical anatomy will form an early part of his course. They can be packed in barrels safely and transported. I have for 4 years past supplied myself from Baltimore and am thus enabled at all times to keep my rooms open to everyone who has curiosity enough to visit them." In a separate letter, Phelps revealed the racial reasoning that Baltimore was his city of choice, noting that, quote, he would be very glad to have him, McGill, bring 1 or even 2 subjects with him, if possible, and would prefer that they be colored ones, having always used such here in consequence of the disturbances which are occasionally made about grave marauders. Phelps soon resigned his academic position and recommended McGill attend the lectures at nearby Dartmouth. Phelps's close connection to that school and the intervention of Musse paved the way for McGill's admittance. The result was 2 separate transportations of black medical subjects to New England for McGill's tutelage. The first accompanied him as he traveled from Baltimore to New England for study under Phelps, and the second was the 2 girls dispatched to Dartmouth, detailed at the beginning of this paper. That New Englander Phelps claimed that Baltimore had been his primary source of medical subjects for several years is significant. Equally important, the second shipment's elaborate false barrel plans for depositing the subjects in Boston were based upon the instructions Musse left with another Baltimore doctor. It seems unlikely that Musse could have developed such a complicated system for clandestinely transporting Baltimore's deceased to New England without previous trials. Perhaps Phelps and Musse are crackpots or outliers, but their preference for importing black bodies from the enslaved South rather than New England port cities suggests the need to reevaluate the traffic in black bodies as more than a purely Southern phenomenon and a trade that extended far beyond the local. It is also important to remember the hands holding the dissecting knife. All previous scholars who have examined antebellum medical practices have assumed that all who received medical training in the United States were white. And certainly, given the paucity of trained African-American doctors before the American Civil War, this is usually a fair assumption. Gretchen Long argues that antebellum black physicians like James McCune Smith and Augusta Washington had to receive their degrees abroad, as no medical school or teaching hospital would admit them to the United States. She also notes that these African-American physicians were freeborn Northerners. However, there were possibilities for such medical training for African-Americans under the auspices of the ACS, as the society desperately needed trained settlers in Liberia to administer to the needs of its sickly colony. If McGill became the first African American to receive a medical degree from an institution in the United States, then his protege, Dempsey Fletcher, certainly became the first former slave to do so. Of course, such constrained possibilities were dictated by promises of relocation to Liberia. There were some African Americans who reneged on this promise after securing training, but it would be folly to interpret those who did immigrate, like McGill, solely through a Liberian filter. McGill would return to the United States numerous times after the completion of his medical studies, fully exhibiting that mobility which characterized the 19th century Atlantic. Exchanging his claims on the United States for an Atlantic or Liberian citizenship was a prerequisite for McGill to attain his degree. Securing that degree required skill with the scalpel and control over black bodies, a command familiar to this agent of colonialism in Africa. Having relinquished claims to a black American identity, McGill exhibited no empathy for those who came under his knife. He certainly was not a passive agent in the plans for securing anatomical subjects from the very same population, Baltimoreans of African descent, to which he had previously belonged. For McGill's part, the surviving letters do not indicate any qualms or hesitation to commence dissection on black bodies. Indeed, he was the one who passed along Phelps's instructions to the colonizationists requesting 2 black bodies for dissection. He also shared his profession's ghoulish humor about their dissecting subjects, referring to the cadavers as slicer meat. Similarly, he vivaciously reported that during his initial move to New England, with the bodies destined for Phelps's dissecting table, a sailor on the prowl for a stiff drink of whiskey tapped the barrel, quote, and took a draw. The flavor or taste, not exactly suiting his palate, led to an examination. The contents were discovered, and it was noised abroad. McGill also had difficulty interacting with the United States' population of living African Americans. A freeborn man of mixed ancestry who left the United States as a child and a devout supporter of colonization, McGill distanced himself from those Americans of African descent who voluntarily, as he saw it, remained under the heel of white oppression. The black janitor of the Washington Medical College in Baltimore, a Mr. Golden, was seemingly repulsed by McGill's haughty attitude. After conversing with Golden, Shepard reported to McGill that the janitor's summation of the Liberian as, quote, a proud nigger, end quote. Although claiming to have shown Golden respect, McGill also belittled the janitor's own claims to medical knowledge based upon his experiences in the position as a servant of the college that McGill had originally intended to occupy in his own quest for medical education. To quote Dr. McGill, I have even received lectures from him on the circulation, spelled C-I-R-K-I-L-A-S-H-U-N, circulation, the larger portion of which I knew to be erroneous. He might have led to suppose me a proud nigger. It was necessary he should have such an opinion of me. Otherwise, I should have been a more than normal subgenitor. His being Dr. Golden did not elicit from me the degree of reverence which it was generally paid him by those who had partaken of his nostrums. Consequently, he might have supposed me emulous to acquire superior medical information to what he possessed. Such statements strike at the institutionalization and professionalization of American medicine and society. Although McGill dismissed Golden's lecture on the human circulatory system, his own medical training and McGill's were not terribly dissimilar. McGill was eventually allowed to wield the knife and secured the requisite power over human anatomy to protect his credentials, but otherwise Golden possessed the same medical education as other 19th century students. Hours spent in a classroom listening to lectures and observing the faculty perform the operations. The critical difference is the scalpel and the control over knowledge and also black bodies that it bestowed the wielder. Thus, it probably is no accident that of all the possible lectures for McGill to pinpoint as ludicrous and worthy of mocking, he selected circulation, a knowledge intimately connected with dissection and observing the heart and blood vessels. Control over black cadavers provided McGill a pseudo-whiteness which mirrored his African whiteness. This foreign exotic identity bestowed a respectability that likewise provided McGill a means to control, or at least dismiss as haughty fools, African Americans. The culmination of McGill's ideological separation from African Americans came after he received his medical degree. Although excited to return to Liberia, McGill worried that he lacked the clinical experience necessary to effectively treat his patients. He hoped that he could stop in Baltimore on his way to Africa to conduct clinical work among Baltimore's black community, quoting, quote, even though some lives might be sacrificed, It would not make much difference, provided I use every exertion to save. To hurry the departure of some of your colored population out of this world would not be so great a crime." End quote. McGill did not acknowledge or seem to recognize that he was once part of, quote, "your colored population" in Baltimore. Relocation to Liberia had allowed him to shed that identity. Two separate motions led to the operating theater at Dartmouth. The first, the importation of black dissecting subjects, suggests the necessity of viewing this practice beyond the confines of the South. If poor and itinerant whites were also targets for anatomical study, the mechanisms put in place by Phelps and Musset to pass over those bodies in New England, port cities for black bodies reinforces the commitment of white physicians to locate African-American medical subjects. We should also begin to look askance at every barrel of grain meandering up the eastern seaboard from Baltimore. We also must question what happens to race after death. At the same historic moment in which certain medical professionals, white medical professionals, were arguing for polygenesis and classifying people of African descent as a separate species, these black bodies were considered analogs to whites on the dissecting room table. Scholars of African Americans and medicine need to look to Liberia as well and its early medical practitioners. At the same time that McGill was discovering the preference for black anatomical subjects in the United States, settler Jacob W. Prout, who served as a nurse in Monrovia for newly arrived settlers, reported in 1836 on his newly developed treatment for patients enduring the acclimating fever. Much like American physicians, Prout assumed that the medical conditions and its treatment would be analogous for African American settlers and patients of European descent. He recorded as evidence the results of an autopsy he performed on a deceased European sailor. McGill and his fellow Liberian settlers constructed a new identity, an exotic but civilized blackness forged upon their Atlantic mobility and differentiating themselves from their American origins and African present. The power to control the scalpel on both sides of the ocean, dismiss rival black claims to medical knowledge, and share a chuckle about slicer meat was but one tool employed to shape that identity. Thank you.
All right, thank you both for your wonderful presentations. I'll try to keep my remarks to between 7 and 8 minutes. And I'll begin by exploring what I see as the main connections between the papers. And then I'll raise individual questions for both of the presenters. So each of the papers presented here today examined a commerce in bodies that are raced as black, and rose some questions about the problems of either historical knowledge or memory about that commerce. So Evelyn's paper talked about the traffic in enslaved Africans that was conducted from slave dungeons off the coast of Ghana, across the Atlantic, and to various destinations in the Americas. And Robert has drawn our attention to the traffic in dead black bodies conducted across regional and state borders in the United States. And in both of the presentations, they problematize the ways in which certain sites are made to bear the burden of representation, if not the burden of memory, of a commerce that exceeded their local territories. So in the case of the transatlantic slave trade, Evelyn mentioned that Africa is seen as the site of slavery and made to bear the burden of responsibility for the slave trade, thereby eclipsing the role, as other scholars like Sandra Richards have mentioned, the role of Europeans in establishing and building these castle dungeons, the fact that European territories were the main controllers of the slave trade, built the ships, transported the slaves, and even some more, in addition to the transatlantic dimension of the slave trade, we can also think about the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. So this was a practice, a commerce that involved a vast amount of territories. So what does it mean, right, to make Africa, and in this case Ghana particularly, bear the responsibility of that entire history, and the ways in which the memory practice conducted at slave dungeons by both Ghanaians and as well as these global forces of commerce, right? Because you didn't mention, but roots tourism is also a driving force behind all of this, right? The way that you can use a historical atrocity to build a tourist industry, right, and to make money from that history. And so, and Robert has talked about how the traffic in black cadavers is seen as exclusive to the U.S. South, when in fact it involved medical practitioners as well as and other agents, including resurrectionists, who were either in the North or had some connection with the North. And so my question to you all is, Evelyn, what do we lose sight of when we fail to see the transatlantic dimensions of the slave trade, right? And what happens, and the ways in which, as I asked earlier, those practices at the slave dungeons perpetuates that in many ways by claiming it as Ghana's and Ghana's to own that story. And Robert, what do we come to see differently when we understand the national and the non-local dimensions of this trade in black cadavers? Can we see this practice as constitutive of a larger U.S. medical practice? And does it also reflect other national phenomena? For example, if we think about the differential relations of power between racial groups, can we think about this medical practice as a reflection of broader racial processes? So the second point that I'd like to talk about is how both of the papers raise issues of culpability and agency as they pertain to the traffic in black bodies. And you mentioned, Evelyn, as I stated earlier, that Ghanaians are held responsible for the traffic. And Robert, you mentioned that white physicians were the main perpetrators of using black bodies for anatomical dissection. But McGill allows us to see that African Americans were also involved, either at the level of him being a physician or of resurrectionists who were digging these bodies up. And so how are we to understand then the historical relations that are erased? Because Evelyn made the point that when you see the slave trade as something that belongs to Africa and Africans as solely responsible, that you erase the historical relations that made the slave trade possible, or that. So how are we to understand what are the historical relations that are making McGill's participation in this medical practice possible, as well as that compels African Americans to get involved in this job of resurrectionism? Is it the case that people can't find any other type of employment, and so this seedy illegal employment becomes a way for them to get some type of employment, and that inability to find employment or a way of living is itself a product of racial inequality, right? So the third question is, you both talked about how claims over black bodies are used to make a stake in making claims over national sovereignty or over superior medical knowledge. And so in the case of Ghana, Evelyn, you mentioned that Ghana uses the slave trade to imagine black bodies as humans who've always been emancipated. And Ghana always being a sovereign nation, right, that had power, and that they tap into that history to state contemporarily that they want to draw from this network of these enslaved people who were dispersed through the slave trade to make claims to global modernity as a way to build Africa and to make it a modern power. And so, and Robert, you mentioned the ways in which, sorry, I lost my place. Oh, and so you mentioned the ways in which the use of black bodies is used to make claims over superior medical knowledge, in the sense that the ways in which physicians separate themselves as professional from other groups of people, like traditional healers, midwives, et cetera, is because they have access to these bodies and they're able to extract medical knowledge from them, right? So that third question, the third set of problems brings me to the fourth and final set of issues that I will raise that are explored in both of the papers, and that is issues of remembering and disremembering. And so, Evelyn, to me it seems that the concept of memory that animates your paper is both, because you do re-member, And so it seems to me that it's both the sense of putting something that has been dismembered or severed back together again, right? And the case of remember, in the case of the return of what was forgotten. So, for example, you talk about how Ghanaians are remembering slavery in the sense that it has made a return in this post-colonial moment, whereas heretofore, locally, those knowledges were not being discussed, but now there's an impulse to remember, or that there's a remembering going on in the term of reconnection, a relationship that had been severed. And so how in the historical imagination, it seemed that the relationship between Africa and the diaspora has been severed, and that around the tourist practices, the memory practices at these slave sites, there can be a reconciliation of sorts, right? But then you also talk about how there's a clash between post-colonial memory in Africa of slavery and the slave trade, and that of diaspora memory, right? And so I wanted to ask you, what are we to make of the disjuncture between those two memories? And what implications each of them has for how we do and do not remember the slave trade, right? And the problems adhering in each of those, the post-colonial memory and the diaspora memory, as you would call it. And so, Robert, you talked about, obviously the problem of dismemberment figures very literally in your case, right, in terms of people using these black bodies to dissect and extract medical knowledge. But you also talked about disremembering and dismembering in the case of McGill, and you talked about how he's trying to separate himself from black communities, as well as he disremembers his roots in the Baltimore community. And I want to ask, is this really a case of disremembering or dismembering? Or is it the case that there's something about US medical practice that demands that one performs a separation from the black body, right? Whether that agent is black or not. And in other words, there's an othering inherent to a US medical practice that uses black bodies to extract medical knowledge. And in the historical case, that knowledge is unevenly used to help white people, right? And so the bodies upon which that very knowledge is founded is frequently excluded from the benefits that are drawn from that knowledge, right? So yes, is it really a dismembering, or is it something constitutive of US medical practice that is what's driving that disconnection? So now I'd like to move to the particular question. So Evelyn, you you mentioned this distinction between figurative and literal slavery. And I just wanted to talk about a way to put pressure on that distinction and how that distinction itself facilitates a particular type of disremembering. And so the conditions that prompt many people to claim that we live in racial slavery's afterlife are very material and embodied conditions. So in the United States, for example, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime. And in the aftermath of emancipation, wherever it happened, whether you're in the US North or in the South, you see the increase of black populations in prisons. Whether you're in New York City or Montgomery, Alabama, you see, so there's this very literal connection that especially people who do prison work for the dismantling of prisons, they consider themselves abolitionists because they draw this very real connection between racial slavery and contemporary imprisonment, of which black people are disproportionately affected by. As well as the fact that with the definitions that you've given, when we think of slavery exclusively as the property in human beings or the relation between master and slave or involuntary servitude, then that effaces some very cardinal and important dimensions of slavery. In particular, when we think about slavery as social death and civil death, or to think about, some would even say that the continuation of white governance over black subjection and the intransience of racism are themselves what's perpetuating this afterlife of slavery, because that relation was instituted during slavery, and the fact that it's still here, that means that slavery has yet to end. And so I wanted to raise those questions, what exactly is the slavery that is being remembered, right? And as well, the second question I wanted to ask was about the historical role of the dungeons for Ghanaians. And so you talked about how they use it to stake sites, to stake claims for their their entrance or rise in global modernity. But at the same time that these castle dungeons symbolized or performed captives' entry into slavery, did they not also represent Ghana's entrance into colonial modernity, right? And so when I think about colonial modernity, I'm thinking about the ways in which colonialism and slavery are really the driving forces and the constituent components of European modernity, the rise of the nation state, industrialism, and industrialization, and things of this nature. So, yeah, what are the connections between not just contemporary global modernity, but between historical colonial modernity and these slave castle dungeons, to think about that connection. And the third and final question I'll ask you, is there any sense in which we can say that Ghanaians and Africans more broadly are living in the afterlife of post-colonialism? Because you talked about the afterlife of slavery that diaspora blacks live. But it seems to me that a lot of what you talked, some of these tensions surrounding Ghana's fight to lay claims to sovereignty has to do with the fact that their own processes of national independence remain incomplete. And I'm thinking about how, about Western governments' over-involvement in the continent's affairs. I'm thinking about the constant pilfering of the continent's national resources that's ongoing, as well as some contemporary conflicts about territory and boundary that are still going on, were very much instituted during the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. So how might we think about Ghanaians and Africans living in the afterlife of post-colonialism? And so, Robert, my questions for you is that you elaborated how control over black bodies and the power to wield the scalpel were central to the professionalization of medical doctors, particularly as it concerned the study of anatomy. And I'm wondering how you see this practice, these anatomical practices, fitting into the larger American medical profession as a whole, because I know that, for example, J. Marion Sims, who's known by many as the father of American gynecology, he pioneered medical knowledge in the field as well as perfected surgical instruments that are still used today by experimenting on enslaved women's bodies. And as well as the fact that this intranational dimension of that commerce that you've talked about, it went from beyond just the level of circulating bodies, but also where people went to school. For example, Sims was educated in Philadelphia, and then he did his experimentations in Alabama. So what's that network as well in the American medical practice? And my second and final question for you is, how does the preferred use of black bodies for medical dissection and experimentation complement prevailing notions of the human? And for me, for example, a lot of anatomical knowledge is predicated upon the premise that white and male bodies are the norm, the human norm, and that non-white and female bodies are deviations, if not abominations, of that norm, right? And when we think about the concept of the human historically, the concept has been centered around white male subjecthood and subjectivity, and people of color and women have had a very vexed relationship to it, if not excluded from it altogether. So what does it mean that black bodies in general, and black female bodies in particular, are then the bodies from which medical knowledge, right, about the human body more generally, is extracted, right, and that they're making general claims about the human body based on these bodies that are allegedly not human? So those are all of the questions that I had, and so we can now open the floor for questions.
I really hope you have an answer to that question.
Oh, that's
Sure.
Sure.
think about for your work.
Maybe not right now.
There we go.
Thank you both. My question sort of follows from Patricia's comments, but what both of your papers sort of called to mind was Vincent Brown's book, Reaper's Garden, about death and the rituals around death enacted by Jamaican slaves as a way to create certain spaces for political autonomy and resistance and consciousness in relation to the colonial British government. I was sort of interested in, kind of death and mourning as sort of a theme that you're both kind of working with. And so for Evelyn, I was, the story of Joseph is so compelling because there was that moment, that slide where clearly there's a lot of anguish and a lot of emotion going on that seems to be required for this kind of reconciliation to happen. I was kind of curious, with all the kind of the tourism industry, all the kind of bureaucracy that's sort of involved to structure this kind of reconciliation, are there certain performances or rituals of mourning, loss, death, and then renewal and reconciliation between the Ghanese and returning African Americans? And for Robert, I was really interested in the cadaver and also the theme of bodies in motion as, sort of occurred to me that, what a great way or great frame to look at, antebellum slavery and the debates around slavery at that time. It really made me think about, Dred Scott in a new way. The idea that, and the fugitive slave laws, if you're a slave and even when you move across the Mason-Dixon line, you are, you're not really a person. You're somebody who no rights that a white man has to respect, and you're kind of made legally dead, and that's, now you have a cadaver, like a literal dead black body that seems like different kinds of practices are involved in making that motion happen. So I just wanted to, take a step back from your very thick narrative that he gave us, how death might be like a way or a frame of casting back on what slavery was, both as like a social and legal kind of relationship.
First.
Sure. So I really appreciate your question. It is interesting just because when I first went to Cape Coast Castle, I expected sadness and this idea of sadness to be just lingering around the castle, but instead what you see is the local children playing soccer, people are fishing in the water. It's not sad, and the atmosphere isn't sad as well. It's a lot for the locals at least, but then when the people that you have that are going on the tours are very sad, and the rituals of, I guess, around death are very different for Ghanaians who, in death, there's more of a celebration in the sense of life, right? It's not sad in that way. And so one of the questions I actually asked one of the tour guides was, why doesn't it seem sad? Where's the sense of sadness? And it's interesting because there was actually a restaurant that they had opened up in Cape Coast Castle, and he said that that people were so uncomfortable with the fact that, or the people that were visiting the castle, the diasporans, were so uncomfortable with the laughter that was coming from the restaurant that they had to relocate the restaurant off the castle, and they turned it into a library, right? Instead of, there's this idea that the members of the diaspora want it to be sad because of the way that they're connecting to the castle in a particular way, whereas Ghanaians are not seeing that sense of sadness. So one of the things I think that's being done by reintroducing like slavery in this way in terms of the project is that connecting it to these ideas of sadness around slavery, so that people are sad, or the Ghanaians are actually saddened by slavery and understand why members of the diaspora are sad when they go on the tours, and the kinds of things that happen emotionally for a lot of people as they I guess retrace the steps of their ancestors in a way. So yeah, and there are definitely rituals around sadness and death, and yeah, but what it is I think it's definitely drawing more on the diaspora sadness rather than a sadness that's coming out of Ghana, because it's just not. One of the interesting things that the tour guide said to me was that Ghanaians often laugh when they should cry. And I thought that was so interesting, and that was in response to this question, because I'm asking, where's the sadness? And he's like, Ghanaians are funny people. They often laugh when they should cry. And I was like, okay, I don't really get it, but I kind of get it, right? So, yeah.
No, in terms of motion, I mean, my subfield is geography, so I lean heavily on mobility studies, which are, if you're a geographer, you call these spaces of flow, which is sort of I love that phrase, if only because you normally think of space as a stagnant, immobile thing that you pass through instead of a thing unto itself, a mobility. And so, in terms of the trade in black cadavers, on the one hand, you have the sort of continued commodification of blackness, even after slavery, after abolition, or just after death, that blackness is still considered, something that can be purchased for $6 and shipped. And where this this journal chapter has a bunch of question marks and angry notes from me to myself, and it is this idea of mobility with the black experience. On the one hand, mobility is associated with freedom, right? The ability to move on your own volition and not be challenged. Conversely, it also has an element of enslavement to it, the inability to choose your own destination. And so motion and mobility has a real tense give and take relationship with slavery and the African Americans in the 19th century. And so that's one of the things I would, if you have thoughts, tell me after this, because I'm working. I have two segments that I'm still working out, which is so I think the phrase "a thick narrative" is fair. This is a little more of a storytelling than I'm used to, but I wanted to throw out the narrative and then hopefully get something back. I'm being really cruel and selfish, because that's one thing that I'm working through. And the other thing, and I wish you had told me the answer instead of asked the question, is the paradox of race after death, right? This idea that these are you're absolutely right, that the normative body is white and male, and so on the one hand, all this medical knowledge is coming from non-normative bodies. So, and yet they're rendered analogs to whites in medical experimentation. But the whole reason that they're being targeted intentionally and why the African American community cannot defend their dead is because of the race as well. And so those are my two things that I am wrestling with right now and don't have good answers to, other than to say paradox, right? And it's funny, it's not even Harriet Martineau, the British author, visited Baltimore in the 1830s, and she has this great sarcastic quote because she shows up in Baltimore in the winter, which is the prime grave robbing season because it's cold and it falls between the fall and spring lectures. And so she's there in Baltimore in the winter, and she has this entry about, isn't it wonderful that after death, blacks are finally accorded full equality with whites on the dissecting room table. So there, you don't even need the scholarly analysis. The people in the 1830s recognized the paradox that's going on to the point where a British author passing through a city can recognize that this is not cognitive dissonance. I need to take more psychology to figure this out.
Because you're a historian, you don't have to solve anything at all.
See that? Yeah.
Which show there's a paradox and show why it's significant.
Yeah. That's just, it feels so, I know.
It's great, so this is your route, but
Yeah.
You get sort of, I think you're right saying the medical, the polygenesis is like definitely makes this matter. I would also say look at the law, because this is where they're also wrestling with this very contradiction and with different outcomes in Dred Scott v. Sanford, but also Lemon v. New York, that this is a real contested concept. The black body in motion is a problem.
We have time for one more brief question.
I have a question for both of you, so it might not be brief. So for Evelyn, thank you for the wonderful talk. I know that you start the main point of inquiry of your study in Ghana and going out to the diaspora, but I was really interested to hear about how the rest of the sovereign nations of the continent of Africa responded to or engaged with this initiative, and kind of has there been like a reverse reconciliation going, between other sovereign nations within Africa, particularly West Africa, And then Kentucky, you know, I think about when I go to visit my grandparents' grave in Kentucky, the cemeteries were segregated, right?
Yes.
Was that like a national phenomenon, and is that how these grave diggers were able to kind of locate black bodies and know what parts of the cemetery were safe or whatever?
So yeah, that's a great question actually, and that's something that I do kind of take up as I question why Ghana didn't reach out to other African nations in order to take up this project, but it was a project that they took up themselves, it seems, on behalf of Africa in a sense. And so I don't think that there are actually other nations that are kind of taking up similar projects. I do know that in Senegal, Gore Island, they have sort of the same kind of tours and the kinds of things that they do have in Ghana, but I don't know if they've taken up any kind of project of reconciliation. But one of the things I do ask as part of my project is why Ghana didn't kind of build on the networks in the West Africa to kind of make this an African project, but for Ghana to claim it as an African project solely based on itself, and how that kind of complicates things a bit. So that's something that I'm going to be looking into, so I don't really have an exact answer for that.
No, so the cemeteries are segregated. Intriguingly, from what I've been able to glean from Bill is that usually the so-called African burial grounds, right? The African American community cemeteries are usually not the ones targeted, because they are embedded within the community and are protected in some fashion, that they are watched, observed, that people are aware of what's going on. It's typically the potter's fields, which are just cemeteries for the poor with no other place, and they're buried at the city expense. I mean, and by buried I mean sort of a shallow grave, and in you go, and that's that. That most, I can't say all of them, but at least all the ones I've studied, they at least have a nominal, a segregated potter's field, but those are the ones that, because there's just, the city does not care, because they're for the poor and indigent, because these are often sailors or people without families or without that connection, that community to police the graves, those are the fields that the resurrectionist targets. And usually, from what I've been able to glean, target number one is usually the black section of the potter's fields.
We just have a couple more minutes. I have just one question. On this question of this important question of the status of the black body kind of before or after death, it seems to me to be a question of sovereignty, right? Because it seems to me that even now, the analogy to this is that undocumented service people are granted citizenship after they're killed in combat, right? So the state decides at what point your body becomes either valuable or worthless, right? And so even at the point of the birth certificate tells you where or you are not, it still seems to be a matter of the sovereign question. And this is an ongoing question if we relate to this notion of death then granting citizenship to people who prior, it's worthless at this point, right? This is the point of tension with respect to this DREAM Act, right? Why should you be granted citizenship if you've been killed before it doesn't matter at this point? And then relating this to Evelyn's question on this question of sovereignty and this notion of visas but no citizenship, right? Land ownership but no possession of the land as a citizen. Seems to be the same question, and I'm wondering if you can talk about both these things kind of as they relate to sovereignty and what Ghana is doing. What is Ghana up to with just visas and no citizenship?
I don't know what they're up to actually, but I think that I was actually going to address Patricia's question in terms of the afterlives of post-colonialism. So, and living with that. So one of the things that when I spoke to somebody about the project, and he talked about this, right? So Ghana really wants, diasporas to come and invest in a very particular way, but what are you offering? But then they can't really offer anything real in that sense, because and those are the questions that I kind of asked. What does it mean for Ghana to offer citizenship to people who can kind of prove that they are descendants of slaves? What would that really mean in terms of sovereignty, in terms of, especially as a lot of these people are coming from America? So what would that mean for them to now get Ghanaian citizenship, and why was it, you know, this idea of a visa, which is, I think it's about like $60 or something like that, that they're thinking to waive rather than something else, right? So it's really, you're just getting a stamp in your passport. So why didn't you give me a Ghanaian passport instead of just giving me a stamp in my passport? So there's all these questions, and these are questions that come from the diaspora, and why a lot of people, I don't want to say they didn't take the project seriously, but they were very weary of engaging it in a very particular way, because they kind of understood that maybe it was a little bit superficial in a sense, and that really, even though as a nation state, the sovereign, there's still these afterlives of post-colonialism that doesn't give Ghana the power to really engage in questions about citizenship, but maybe they can do a visa in a sense, right? So I think it's about the boundaries and these afterlives of post-colonialism that doesn't allow the space for Ghana to make the decisions in terms of what they really want to do with a project like this, yet still offering the project because of what it means economically for what it means economically.
Yes. No, I think that's the point is well taken. If only, in many regards, because of the lack of the state could determine that these potters' fields are, after death, worthy of protection in any, I mean, from the we're talking things as basic as a wall, that there is no investment by the state in either ensuring the security of this ground, say, anything. And so they are easy targets because they were poor and often without family, or the family does not have the means to, put them in a graveyard associated with a church or a benevolent association. The lack of attention to the state in deciding that they're citizens after death is how, the resurrectionists function. So, yes, very much so.
Please join me in. We have one more question.
I just wanted to know how you found out what bills actually were, and is there a way to address this question of the value of the Black Party and that by virtue of what the procurers or the reporters thought about what they were doing?
How I came so how this is not a dissertation chapter is that I technically study Liberia, and I was tracing the McGills are. We're in New England, so they're the Kennedys of Liberia. And so I was tracing McGill just on his activities, and these series of letters cropped up. And what the significance, as sort of a professional significance beyond the ideas here, is that there's a field of scholars that study African American medical history, and they look at medical school records and doctors' records, and these records are actually they're spread across some various colonizationist archives. And the whole reason, the specifics of the trade, how the barrels were constructed, the pricing, none of the sort of medical side of the field has any sort of detail along those lines, because McGill not being, not having the sort of connections in the United States, and his connections are the colonization society, who they're businessmen. And so literally the doctors had to write out instructions on this is how you get a body. And it's a rare document in terms of, it's like drug dealing. These things were never told out, written out, and it's just by virtue of the peculiarity of the situation which we actually have instructions on how it's done. And so that's why I'm thinking journal article with this, because it's both, raising some interesting questions about what do we do with this African American physician, what do we think about in terms of blackness after death and the commodification of blackness, but it's also just I'm not these medical historians, and they don't know that this exists, and I'm trying to merge the two. So there's a professional aspect to this of getting the people that want to know about this in touch with this literature, because the colonization societies, because Liberia is a death trap, they are they are training African Americans for medical education. A lot of people are familiar with Martin Delaney. Delaney is in the first class at Harvard Medical School that has African Americans and a white woman in it, and it fails on its face. They're admitted, and then they are almost immediately, they're not thrown out, they have a nice meeting with the faculty, and then they withdraw. So Delaney goes back home, and he's furious, and he writes the condition. And that's sort of, a lot of historians point to that being, if not expelled politely, which I doubt he was politely, told to leave Harvard, is the beginning of Delaney's radicalization and his turn towards immigration. The other two African Americans in his class that nobody talks about are Isaac Snowden and Daniel Lang, and they're there because the Massachusetts Colonization Society is sending them there. They just go to Dartmouth. They just switch college degrees, and so the colonizationists are actually investing in medical education, and the people that study African American education aren't aware of that because it's not their archive. Going back to this question of archive.